Okay, I will slowly start my presentation. Mm, This is my problem right now. I have too many notes, none of them are conclusive, so at some point I have to get rid of them so that they don't confuse me anymore. But at this point, I'm so excited that I keep looking at them, but I actually read nothing, so I'm just talking so that I don't get any more anxious. Okay. Um, Thanks everyone for coming. I think this is going to be the last coine of this session. I don't know if Buffet will continue in the summer. But yeah, before the finals week, we are closing with self-understanding. And I thought that this would be a pretty, not easy, but basic theme to talk about, because it's basically like ordinary terms. Like we use understanding and we don't use self, but we use I for most of the propositions, most of the sentences that we talk about. But this turned out to be the hard part of the presentation, because talking about ordinary language or talking about the concepts that everybody, I assume, is sort of familiar with or sort of use intuitively, it's really hard to set up the limits of where should I stop, until what point I can investigate it here, or until what point we actually experience this, or if we experience this. So I have two vantage points. One of them is kind of asking the question of what is a self, and the other point is understanding. And my main aim here will be to convince you that kind of self arises in understanding, or if there are different types of tools to investigate a thing, a being, something that is out there, a concept, a term, then understanding as a tool is kind of more revealing about the self, about what self is, or maybe even constitutes the self as we try to understand this, as we try to talk about it. And if anybody wants references, this talk is kind of inspired by Sartre's sort of short article called Transcendence of the Ego. And I adopted some of the problems that Sartre poses in that article, but I don't find the conclusions or the reasons that he gives towards the end very convincing. He will basically talk about what is a self and how there are two selves that we are actually talking about, and one of them is something that is concrete, the me that you are seeing here, that me, this psychophysiological me who's experiencing stuff. And there's another self which we think that it is ordinary, and that we think that it is kind of the constitutor of the life world, of the experiences, but is actually a product of reflection, and encounters every limit, every problem that we have about reflection, that it's the same problems that we have about that self, and that is he will call a transcendent object. But before going on to that, and I don't want to inflate this conversation with just Sartre's article, but before going to there, I want to stick to the ordinary sense first. So we use I, and I want you to think about when we use I the most. Like, what are the experiences that you say I as a dominant figure in the sentence, and that you feel obligated to use it, obligated to present yourself as a subject, and feel like you can't explain the situation without referring to an I. So, for example, I feel something. I did this because I was experiencing this. I did this because I'm coming from this background, or I'm coming from there. I did this because I like it, or something happened to me, or I'm feeling this, blah, blah, whatever it is. When we use the word I want you to think about when it is most prominent in the sentence, when it gives a sense. Whereas in experience, when you are experiencing something, do you go there like with the full confidence that I am doing this, or it's just that you're kind of in an experience and then there are other factors, and you are not really you are sort of conscious, but you are not really conscious of all these things that you are bringing into the table. You are just somehow responding, somehow sometimes creating something. You are sometimes talking in a conversation and the conversation flows, and you are there, but can you really support everything that you have said in the conversation? Are you do you know why did you do this? Do you know why you feel something? So this is kind of the paradox of subjectivity, and it does not start with Sartre, obviously. Hello. And but Sartre has some questions that I found important. First of them was this: when we talk about the I, normally we think that we are the subject and we are creating an experience, we are doing something. But when you look at through the reflection, you also see that these things shape you, and you see yourself in the world as an object, as others perceive you. And so you have this internal subjective part that you cannot really share unless you talk, unless you give a testimony, or you try to bring something out there. But also there is this objective pole of the I, that how the others perceive you. So Sartre talks about this paradox of subjectivity, and he says that there is something, of course, there is a subject, but that subject is totally out there. It is the psychophysiological me, meaning that I am nothing but all the things that I have experienced, all the things that have constituted me in my life. But the I that I'm talking about, as the I that is kind of originating the experience, it is a transcendent object. It is something that appears in reflection. So I am nothing else but everything that I have experienced. And he talks about this infinite totality of experiences contracted. So I'm trying to imagine that kind of a me, but that me is, of course, not really imaginable, because we cannot really understand what infinite totality of all the experiences mean. But what he says that basically only thing that exists is this embodied being that is out there, that is experiencing. And why do we posit I? He gives this concrete example. He gives Peter and Paul, of course, he has Peters and Pauls in his writings. He talks about Peter and Paul, and Peter doesn't like Paul because of some situation. He feels repugnance towards Paul. So in this moment, there is this repugnance. It means disgust. There is this disgust, which is momentary. So there is this consciousness of disgust, this spontaneous consciousness, whose duration is limited with the duration of experience, that is the duration of this encounter. And this is out there, right? This is directly observable. When somebody feels an emotion, for it to count as an emotion, they have to show it to you in some way. You kind of sense it. You sense that this person is kind of okay, feeling pleasant. This kind of person is feeling somehow how down. If you are sad, you don't go there using all these gestures that belong to being angry, if you want to be understood as sad. So there is this sort of like a socially arranged ways of expressing what we feel. And sometimes these feelings just arise out of the situation. This is a situation where people hate one another. This is a situation where you feel disgust towards another. It's not something that you are totally in control of. So there is this direct experience of feeling disgust at that moment. And then there's this quality, there's this feeling of hate that extends towards the future too. So you have now this consciousness who's also thinking that I will probably hate Peter in the future. So you are making this projection towards the future, thinking that this feeling will continue. Even if you don't consciously think that you hate Peter, it's always there. If somebody asks you, oh yeah, I hate him, it's there. If it's not, even if it's not invoked, it's there. This is also a direct experience according to Sartre. What is indirect is that we say that maybe I'm a hateful person. Maybe I'm spiteful in general. Maybe I have the quality of spitefulness in me, so that when somebody does something to me, I incline towards being hateful towards them. So I have this quality. I acquired this quality. He says that this is not direct, and this is not observable. This is not accessible towards other people. So this, if because we are able to posit this insight, this interiority, it brings forward this paradox of subjectivity. But he says that in fact, this is reflection. This is not real me. This is what the reflection creates. It's the object of reflection, and it's not really out there. It's not really accessible by the others, and it's a product of reflection. This I who is hateful is not actual me who's feeling it, but it arises at the end of this process. So it's not I uh, mm, as being in an ordinary position, in a position where it created the hate in the first place, but it is a result of the thinking process. Oh, I experienced this. I also experienced this in a long run. Maybe I have this quality. Maybe I am this person. So it's the end of the reflective process. So he says that this is factive, and it's a transcendent object. It's and I mean, he uses transcendence and immanence in a different way. He says that immanent is something that is factual, that is out there, that is related to facticity, but transcendent is something that you cannot really enclose, that you cannot really think really about your mind, but it's kind of transcends your mind. So this I is a transcendent object, and it's not the actual psychophysiological me that I'm talking about. And this I is not really there, but we suppose it. And he will tell later why we presuppose an I as such. And this part is the part that I don't find convincing. So anytime that you want to ask something or you want to add something, you can. And if you don't understand, if I blabber too much in one particular point, you can also tell me. So he will then contradicts two things. We have infinite flow of consciousnesses that create and die with each moment. We have spontaneous consciousness, and then we posit this I as like a block, as like a things to stop, to block the flow of consciousness, so that it creates a safe zone, so that we kind of escape from our radical freedom. He possesses radical freedom, that we have the spontaneous consciousness. We don't actually have these qualities inherent in us, but these qualities actually belong to the skin of the world, kind of. The world has potentially all these qualities of being hateful, all these qualities of being happy, angry, etc. And then when the moment comes, the world kind of carves us in its own image, and in the encounter there is this hatefulness, and it doesn't really belong to me. I don't have to take it as it is in my interiority that I'm coming up with these emotions, but it is out there. And for some parts it's visible by everybody and it's accessible by everybody. So he says that there are two things that creates this paradox. One of them is intimacy, and the other one is, if I'm not let me check, the other one is probably let's see, immediacy and intimacy, he says, I think. Yeah, and he wants to crash this. He says that I is immediate and intimate to us, but he says that I don't want to make this self intimate to me more than to other people. And yeah, he says that self I is posited because we are afraid of our radical freedom. And I find this part not quite convincing because I mean, I think all of us sort of employ this ordinary language where we say that I feel this belongs to me. And um, as a method of in the method of phenomenology, if most people are talking about this I or this having this interiority, can we say that everybody's reasons are the same and we are all afraid of something? We are all afraid of this spontaneous consciousness, and do we really have this spontaneous consciousness? Do we really I mean, we have the psychophysiological me, and it sort of limits us to a point because it brings out all these memories and all these things that have happened to us. We carry this embodied being, and there also some information is saved, and you don't really start from point zero all the time. And he's not saying that we would start from point zero if we wouldn't have I. He is not positing this. But still, I don't really find his conclusion quite convincing. So here then then here I go to a different question because of this. But I get from Sartre these two propositions. First is that there are limits of reflection. So if there's an I that is posited in reflection, this I has all the limits that the reflection also have. And we have to kind of ask the question of what are these limits? How do we understand it? I mean, reflection is a tool. We don't have to negate it all the time. We use it. We use it when we try to understand ourselves. What do we feel? How do we orient ourselves towards other people? But it has its limits. And the question is, how do we search for these limits? What are the tools that could help us in this path? And the second is this, and I quite like it. I, whatever that I is, participates in the world. So he uses this quote, I is an other from Rambo. And he says that it means that I mean, my psychophysiological me and my relation with myself is kind of a social process. It's like when I try to understand myself, I have a necessary distance to myself, and I look at from that distance, and in that distance there are also other people. So when I try to understand other people, maybe I use similar reflective tools. But this is an interesting point. There is an I, there is something that is coming out from the reflection, but it is a distance from us, and that distance that we have to cross in order to understand it is actually something that we do socially to understand other people too. I mean, I see you. I mean, there's of course there's something different of my own I and the other eyes. I'm not saying that they are the same things, but
I just want to say in a couple sentences, I was very uncomfortable with this idea of the kind of distance with I being similar to kind of the distance between ourselves and other people, because there is a categorically different vastness of experience that we encounter both within our immediate self and our reflected self. Even though there is some distance, I agree. I think there's a categorical. It's categorically closer than with other people.
Okay. You are also saying this for the reflective eye, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I will have more to say.
Okay. Okay, because I have a point to make here, and then after that, we look if we are talking about the same things. And I mean, this is also a question. So, yeah, the interesting part that I want to posit here is that distance and the tools that we use when we look upon ourselves. So the other question that I want to ask from here is that yes, what are the limits of reflection? and how should we approach, with what tools should we approach I and subjectivity. And the second one is, why do we posit a self? What is the function of positing a self? And do we need a self? And in what situations do we need a self? So I then ask this question: when do things make sense? When when these experiences combined constitute a life? What is different in life than saying that life is totality? Like, what is different between life and the totality of experiences? Because I think there's a difference. Totality of experiences, first of all, how do we combine them? How do we add one to each other? It doesn't really make sense to me. And then I ask, what is making sense? And then I mean, while doing so, last year I've been reading Ricoeur's Time and Narration, I think in English, Zaman ve Anlatı, and there he talks about Aristotle's Poetics, and in Aristotle's Poetics, he gives the principles of telling a story, and how do we tell a story that is coherent, consistent, and very, very close to life, very convincing, that it's almost real, that we think that yes, it could, somebody could live that, somebody could experience that. He talks about how these principles constitute a life, sort of. And there Aristotle talks about how do we organize these events so that they make up a storyline. And of course he has a main attempt, a special attempt. He wants to talk about tragedies, not all the life, not all the stories that we tell, but tragedies. And for tragedies there has to be some turning point, like things go according to one direction, and suddenly there is this sort of turning upside down of things, and then everything becomes kind of more catastrophic and tragic in the literal sense. And it's something that is more than human agents, and they are kind of destined to live that. But while doing so, he talks about the role of side events. So there's this one storyline, but he says that it's better if people include these side events, side events that happen to these people, if they support this one life story. But you shouldn't add any events that doesn't support and make the reader confused or lose the meaning. So he talks about how to narrate a story so that it is convincing and it's lifelike. Ricoeur will try to extend this principles, these aesthetic principles, to any kind of narration, to our own narration, even to history, because history is a narration too. So this was a really exciting and interesting point. First, I mean, Ricoeur also joins this narration to the time, and how do we understand time, and the relation between time and subjectivity. But it's kind of a different point, so I'm not going to go into there right now. But it was interesting for me because I started thinking about how do we talk about ourselves, or how do we first of all talk about ourselves to ourselves. Yeah, I mean, self-narration. How do we look to ourselves? I mean, you sort of pick some events from your life, or you combine and then organize stuff, and then you disorganize them. You sometimes stick to a story, and then you talk about yourself belonging to that story to some people, and then you just completely sometimes get away from that story, and you talk about something else, etc. So that narration part stuck with me, and it kind of started to make relations with subjectivity. And then I looked at the etymology of narration, and it's coming from gnarus, knowing. and narrare, then it turns to narrat in 17th century, and it means related, told. And it became interesting to me because there is this knowing, but it's not knowing particulars in themselves, but it's knowing them in their relation with one another. So events appearing, or events being making sense, events having their correct positions, sort of, as they relate to other events. So there's this more holistic way of understanding, the holistic way of looking at things, and there each thing has their own proper place, but their own proper place is sort of organized, or sort of determined by others as well, by the other events as well. So then there maybe there in my mind the self and the selfhood kind of started to connect with understanding, because then I asked the question of what is understanding basically, and how is it different from knowing in a more definite sense, like knowing this particular thing as you can see there, as you can grasp it, as you can define according to the, I mean, whatever you want to do with it, you can define it in many ways according to your purpose. But understanding is also a process, because we can say that I understand now, or a teacher can know that whether a student is in the right way of asking questions, like is in the path of understanding. Okay, they're starting to get things. Or if a student is asking totally misleading questions, so understanding maybe sort of involves its own process too. So it kind of posits something out there, that the object of understanding, but then when you try to reach it, the path is kind of included as well. This is
It must be like an event in our life, and this happened to me, and now I understand why I did this.
Yeah, I also thought about this, the movements of self-understanding, if they exist. I mean, yeah, it might be that I mean, I think of understanding in a way that it's like a circumscribing. It's like circling around something. The object is on the center, and then you're circling around it. And after a necessary movement, after a necessary revolving, you might really understand the field. You might really understand where is it. I mean, you cannot maybe really reach it. It might be, it will be directly knowing it's I mean, but if you're talking about an event, it's more like a process, and it's constantly changes. You understand it, but you can also understand it more later, so you can always progress towards it. So I think after a necessary, maybe at some moment, that it starts making sense, because you have circumscribed it, or you have determined the area more. Okay. So yeah, then here in understanding, these are my positions, or like kind of like you can add question mark to each one of them. So I wrote underneath understanding as something that is like a practice, like you can practice it. Of course, I'm not saying that there is one general understanding for everything. I'm not saying that understanding of X is the same understanding of Y, but I'm asking, maybe can we think of it as a movement, or think of it as like a in a more dynamical way, or in a structural way, where there are some principles that organize the event, and yeah, maybe it's like a practice. I mean, the main claim here is that self kind of arises in understanding. When self arises, when we kind of orient towards it, when we have the motivation to look upon it, and yeah, So so yeah, this is the hard part because I'm kind of afraid to say that this is how I'm thinking about this, but this is the proposition that I have. So I'm going to summarize a little bit so that I catch the thought. So Sartre says that there is this spontaneous consciousness, and each consciousness determines a moment, and this moment is followed by another spontaneous consciousness, and actually we have sort of a freedom here to have any quality we have. Of course, we have a psychophysiological me, and we have a determined condition, determined situation in the physical world, but still we don't inherit a quality. We are not something that is predetermined, but we have this spontaneity. And we posit this I as the center because it kind of gives us a reference, and because we kind of with this reference kind of disavow or get away from this freedom that we have. I'm kind of again after agree towards the idea that yes, there is this I that centers, but I want to say that this center is kind of necessary. This was the point that I was trying to get. We have this I because when do these events make up a life? Because we inherit. We want to create this meaning, and for this meaning to arise, and for to have a story to tell, we circumscribe around this center, and this center might change. I'm not saying that we have just one self. I'm saying that the self arises out of narration, and we can change the self, but there is always a center. It's just not one center. How do we change this self? I mean, it's not totally up to us, as perhaps Sartre would be more towards. It's not totally up to us, but we have these encounters, and these encounters sometimes are inconsistent with the self that encounters it. So after a while, the self starts to adapt to a new narrative, and it's a two-way process. This narrative is not something that I totally come up with, or this narrative is not something that is pushed down on me. It's both, because we have these things that we have lived, and these lived things sort of have their own way, sort of have their own movement, and sort of already orients us towards being a certain thing. But then we can always go back, and in these reflective moments organize these events in a different way, so that this center changes. With the same events, we can create a different self, because the organization principles are kind of what matters there. And these organization principles sort of belong to the reflective principles as well. These are the principles of reflection, but they're not logical reflections. They are not logical principles, but they are more aesthetic. The meaning arises in the aesthetics, and we can even understand ourselves sometimes through reading. This is why, I mean, through reading in character development, you see why somebody does something. When I mean in literature, like do the people who read more know more, or do the people who experience know more? I mean, it's the both, depending on how you approach the event. They are both events, and in both there is a self. In this story too, there is a self. So this self, because you also have to have cross a distance in order to understand yourself, why not cross this distance in literature too, and understand a different self? But because you know how to cross this distance now, you can also adopt these principles in your own life too. And life, is that crossing that distance, and there the principles are shared within literature and within life too. This was the point that I wanted to come here, and I have this silly diagram here, and this is the center. The center is the stuff that organizes all the consciousnesses and gives meaning to them, gives them a position. So I'm here because I want to attempt this, I want to do this, blah, blah, blah. And you have this stuff that attends things, that goes places. But this stuff could very well, I mean, this stuff is in itself not the originary one, not the original point, but it's the one that that organizes. Because with positing it, you give meaning to your life, and then and then you can also change this center depending on how you re-narrate it or how you organize it. I mean, this is the basic part that I wanted to come here, and at some point I think I could talk about it. Let me check the we can give a break here, and after if you have any questions, maybe I conclude a little bit, and if you have any questions we can talk about them. I'm going to give a 10-minute break. So I'm going to summarize in like 10 minutes or so to kind of highlight what I'm trying to get at it. My claim is that we can have many selves because these selves serve a function. And when I say many selves, I'm not talking about ontologically what is the source. Of course, as a source we have just one singularity and one consciousness, whatever you say it, but we have many selves, and we should look at it, I think, in an aesthetical way, in its organization, in its appearing. So Sartre says that I is maybe like a block to the flux of consciousnesses. Then we should ask, why do we have this block? Is it because of the fear of this freedom, or do we necessarily need, I mean, not necessarily, but do we need this block to make sense of it? It's like when we I mean, the question here is that, like, why do we talk about an I, and why do we want to organize these events around an I? And here I think the principles are similar to principles of storytelling, and it's in an aesthetic way that we organize them. And it's actually something that Sartre says in his article. It's like he talks about this poetic or creative act of consciousness, and I think I is kind of the very core of this poetic act, because when you have a center, it doesn't have to be just one center, but towards it you can have something that looks like something, like as in a painting. When we say that, oh, it makes sense, we want to say that, oh, it looks like something, it resembles something. In that way, it's like your life, in order to resemble something, you can create and recreate these events in a structural way. And in the center, there is this I that we call, and we organize around it. But as I say, it doesn't have to be just one self. We can have different selves, and I leave it up to the question that whether we can understand the difference, whether we can understand our own change, whether we can understand when we change. I leave it up to question. I don't know if we can understand or don't understand when we change our narration, when we change our life story. But this is promising in this way, because this distance, first, it's not an arbitrary distance that we have with ourselves, but it's a distance of it's a distance, like in the phenomenological tradition, like a distance from which, when you look, the picture makes sense, from which, when you I mean, if I look at it from this close, it doesn't make sense, because I'm too close, I'm too to one with it. But if I look at it from a distance, it starts to make sense. It doesn't mean that I'm in a distance. It's just that from this distance, I make sense to myself. In that way, I'm kind of objectifying myself, but I'm also living it. And the distance is something that I can cross. And that crossing is a sort of like praxis that I can employ. And this praxis, I believe, is something that we already do when we talk about ourselves in our diary, or when we talk about ourselves towards another person, when we talk about a character in general. I mean, when we try to understand another person, it's a distance. I'm not saying that it's the same distance, it's the same easiness, but it's also a distance. And from that distance, that person also makes sense. And sometimes we have this situations where both two friends come together and try to talk about one of their problems, and there we both try to make sense of one person's problem. And this is a peculiar situation. Like, you ask, do you think this is why I did this, or did you observe this pattern, I know this, blah blah, and there's this mutual crossing of that distance. I think this is the interesting part. We are able to rejoin in this self-understanding, whether it's the self of my own self or another person's self. Of course, there are differences between the two, but what I'm trying to get at here is that when we talk about this self, we are talking about it in a way that is trying to be narrated. It's a self that wants to be narrated. It's a self that wants to be talked about, to be understood from this perspective. Yeah, I think this is the main thing that I was trying to get at. And thank you for listening. I will now pause this for the questions.